There is a persistent question that surfaces whenever society confronts extreme violence. Not how it happened, not even why, but something far more unsettling. How does a human being cross the invisible boundary that most of us never even approach? Serial killers occupy a uniquely disturbing space in public imagination. They are not acts of war. They are not crimes of sudden passion. They are patterns, repeated, refined, sometimes methodical, and almost always misunderstood. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: serial offenders are rarely monsters in the cinematic sense. They are human beings, whose psychological architecture developed along a very different path. Tonight we are not examining gore. We are not chasing sensational details. We are examining structure. Because when behavior repeats with precision, it is rarely random. It is patterned. Public narratives often simplify serial violence into a single explanation: evil. It is emotionally satisfying, creates distance. It allows society to draw a clean moral boundary. But psychologically, the word explains very little. Modern behavioral science suggests that serial offending rarely emerges from a single cause. Instead, it tends to form at the intersection of multiple pressures: early instability, emotional detachment, reinforced fantasy, and opportunity. No single factor guarantees the outcome, but certain combinations increase the probability. This is what makes the phenomenon both disturbing and instructive, because it means the path is gradual, not explosive. Many serial offenders share histories marked by early environmental disruption. Not always dramatic, but often consistent: chronic neglect, unstable attachment, unpredictable caregiving. In developmental psychology, early attachment plays a critical role in shaping emotional regulation. When secure attachment fails to form properly, the child may struggle to develop stable empathy mapping. This does not eliminate empathy, but it can distort it. Over time, repeated emotional disconnection can produce a subtle shift. Other people begin to register less as fully autonomous individuals, and more as external objects within the environment. This shift is rarely visible in childhood, but it can become significant later. One of the most consistent psychological markers in serial offenders is the presence of persistent violent fantasy. Importantly, fantasy itself is not abnormal. The human mind routinely explores extreme scenarios. What matters is reinforcement. In many serial cases, fantasy becomes a coping mechanism. Private space of control. A mental environment where the individual regulates stress, humiliation, or powerlessness. Over time, repeated rehearsal strengthens the neural pathways associated with the imagined scenario. The brain becomes efficient at returning to it, and efficiency increases salience. What was once occasional becomes frequent. What was once abstract becomes detailed. What was once disturbing becomes familiar, and familiarity reduces internal resistance. One of the most consistent psychological markers in serial offenders is the presence of persistent violent fantasy. Importantly, fantasy itself is not abnormal. The human mind routinely explores extreme scenarios. What matters is reinforcement. In many serial cases, fantasy becomes a coping mechanism. Private space of control. A mental environment where the individual regulates stress, humiliation, or powerlessness. Over time, repeated rehearsal strengthens the neural pathways associated with the imagined scenario. The brain becomes efficient at returning to it, and efficiency increases salience. What was once occasional becomes frequent. What was once abstract becomes detailed. What was once disturbing becomes familiar, and familiarity reduces internal resistance. For many serial offenders, the first violent act is psychologically decisive. Not because it reveals something new, but because it confirms something already rehearsed internally. The moment matters for another reason: feedback. Human behavior is powerfully shaped by internal reward systems. If the act produces a strong psychological effect, relief, control, emotional discharge, the brain records it. Not morally, neurologically, dopamine pathways reinforce whatever behavior produced the internal shift. And once reinforcement occurs, repetition becomes statistically more likely. Not inevitable, but more likely. For many serial offenders, the first violent act is psychologically decisive. Not because it reveals something new, but because it confirms something already rehearsed internally. The moment matters for another reason. Feedback. Human behavior is powerfully shaped by internal reward systems. If the act produces a strong psychological effect, relief, control, emotional discharge, the brain records it. Not morally, neurologically, dopamine pathways reinforce whatever behavior produced the internal shift. And once reinforcement occurs, repetition becomes statistically more likely. Not inevitable, but more likely. Contrary to popular belief, many serial offenders do not become more chaotic over time. They become more efficient. Patterns stabilize. Risk management improves. Emotional response often flattens. What initially required intense psychological buildup may later require far less. This is one of the most clinically disturbing features. Behavior becomes procedural, refined, sometimes disturbingly calm, because repetition reduces novelty, and reduced novelty reduces internal friction. One of the most persistent public myths is that highly dangerous individuals appear obviously dangerous. In reality, many serial offenders maintain outwardly functional lives. Employment, routine, predictable social interaction. This is not accidental. It serves a protective function. Stable surface behavior reduces scrutiny, and reduced scrutiny preserves opportunity. Psychologically, this requires compartmentalization, the ability to maintain parallel internal and external realities. For most individuals, severe moral contradiction produces overwhelming cognitive dissonance. For some offenders, that dissonance appears significantly muted or strategically managed. Public fascination with serial offenders persists for several psychological reasons. First, these cases violate expected human boundaries. Second, they expose the limits of our predictive systems. And third, they force confrontation with an uncomfortable reality. Extreme harm can emerge from individuals who once appeared ordinary. This creates cognitive unease, because humans prefer visible threat signals. Clear danger, clear separation between safe and unsafe. Serial cases blur that boundary, and blurred boundaries tend to linger in collective memory. If we remove sensationalism, if we remove media distortion, what remains is structure. Serial violence, in most documented cases, is not impulsive chaos. It is patterned behavior emerging from layered interaction between development, neurology, reinforcement, and environment. No single model explains every case, but patterns do exist, and patterns matter, because they shift the discussion away from myth and toward mechanism. There is a reason the subject continues to disturb us. It is not only the violence, it is the pattern, because patterns imply process, and process implies that under certain conditions, extreme outcomes can develop gradually, not suddenly, not mysteriously, but step by step. This does not mean serial offenders are common. They are statistically rare, but rarity does not eliminate importance, because studying the edges of human behavior reveals something broader about the system itself, about stress, because change rarely begins with something dramatic. It does not usually announce itself with a visible fracture. More often, it begins quietly, at the level of perception, at the level of emotional response, at the level of internal regulation. In many examined cases, the movement towards severe violence was not triggered by a single defining moment. It was shaped by accumulation, layer by layer, response by response, a gradual recalibration of what feels acceptable, what feels distant, what feels possible. At first, the individual may still experience resistance, hesitation, internal conflict, but the human nervous system is highly adaptive. Repeated exposure, even in imagination, can reduce emotional intensity over time. What once produced discomfort can begin to produce neutrality, and neutrality over extended periods can become permission. This process is not unique to extreme offenders. It is a general property of human learning systems. The brain continuously updates its thresholds based on experience, based on repetition, based on reward and relief. When a behavior or even a fantasy reduces internal tension, the brain takes note, not morally, mechanically. Relief becomes reinforcement. Reinforcement increases accessibility, and accessibility increases probability. Slowly, incrementally, often below conscious awareness. This is why the progression towards severe antisocial behavior is so rarely explosive at the beginning. It is usually quiet, structured, and disturbingly logical from the inside. Each step often feels internally justified in the moment it occurs. Each boundary shift appears small enough to rationalize, until the cumulative distance becomes visible only in retrospect. This is one of the central difficulties in early detection. Warning signs rarely arrive labeled as warnings. They appear ambiguous, context-dependent, explainable. It is their persistence, their interaction, and their reinforcement over time that begins to alter trajectories. Human behavior is rarely driven by a single variable. It is driven by systems, by feedback loops, by environments that either interrupt or quietly permit escalation. And when interruption does not occur, patterns can stabilize, not suddenly, but progressively. This does not mean severe violence is common. It remains statistically rare, but the underlying psychological machinery is fundamentally human. Adaptation, desensitization, reward learning, cognitive justification. These mechanisms operate in all of us, usually safely, usually within strong social and emotional boundaries. But their existence explains why behavioral drift, in any direction, is possible under the right conditions. Which returns us to the uncomfortable core of the question. Serial offenders are not simply defined by what they did. They are defined by a trajectory that was allowed to continue long enough, without sufficient resistance, to become structurally reinforced. And explainable patterns, once reinforced deeply enough, are remarkably difficult to reverse. This is Night Voyage. And tonight, the objective was not to sensationalize violence. It was to examine the mechanisms that make extreme outcomes possible. Because the most important insights in human behavior rarely come from what is obvious. They come from what is gradual, what is cumulative, what is quietly changing beneath the surface. And in the study of the human mind, those quiet shifts are often where the real story begins.